Cesar Millan has become famous as the dog whisperer, the man who can tame the most untrainable dogs. But now he's being sued, accused of having a pit bull that bit humans and even killed Queen Latifah's dog. Our requests to Millan and Queen Latifah for comment were unanswered in court documents.
For 9 years.
Imagine building something from absolutely nothing. You cross a border with $100 in your pocket. You sleep in a kennel because you have nowhere else to go. And then over the course of a decade, you turn your God-given instinct with animals into a television phenomenon watched by 11 million people every single week. Now imagine all of it disappearing. Not slowly, not gradually, gone. And the reason it disappeared was not what anybody on the outside ever understood. Because the story that got told in the headlines was only about a fraction of what actually happened behind those cameras. There is a version of this story that most people know. A Mexican immigrant with a supernatural gift for calming aggressive dogs gets his own show on National Geographic, becomes one of the most recognizable faces on television, and then disappears from screens after 9 seasons when the controversy around his training methods finally becomes too much for the network to absorb. That version is not wrong exactly, but it is so incomplete that it might as well be fiction. The real story involves a man pushed to the absolute edge of his own survival, a financial war that tore apart everyone connected to the show, and a scientific argument that had been quietly building long before the cameras ever started rolling. To understand how it all ended, you have to start at the very beginning, because the foundation that Cesar Millan built his career on was always more complicated and more fragile than the television version of events suggested. Cesar was born in Culiacan, Mexico, and spent his early years on his grandfather's farm surrounded by animals. From a very young age, something happened when he moved through spaces where dogs were present that did not happen when other people moved through those same spaces. The animals settled. They followed. They did not challenge. He was not doing anything that could be easily explained or taught. It was instinct expressed through his body, through his energy, through the specific way he occupied physical space. He had decided by the age of 10 that he wanted to dedicate his life to dogs. Not as a hobby, not as a side interest, as a profession, and specifically as the best in the world at what he did. The path from that childhood decision to a Hollywood television career was not a clean or comfortable one. Veterinary school was financially impossible for his family, so he made a different plan. He would go to the United States, find the people working at the highest level with animals in film and television, and learn from direct observation and direct experience. On December 23, 1990, he said goodbye to his mother and traveled north toward a border crossing that was far more dangerous than any fence or checkpoint. He crossed into California carrying almost no money, speaking almost no English, and knowing not a single person on the other side. He ended up sleeping in the kennel where he had managed to talk his way into a job. He ate from dumpsters. The dogs around him were sheltered and fed better than he was. Eventually, he worked his way to Los Angeles, built a dog walking business in Inglewood that became successful enough to catch the attention of local press, and through that press coverage began attracting clients from wealthier parts of the city. Word spread because what he was doing genuinely worked. That was never the question. The question was always about how and why it worked, and that question would eventually become the central fault line of his entire career. His introduction to the world that would make him a television star came through Jada Pinkett Smith, who saw him work with a dog belonging to someone in her circle and immediately understood that she was watching something different from standard dog training. She told him directly that if he was ever going to reach a television audience, he would need to develop his English to a level where a camera could carry it. She sent a language tutor to his apartment the following day. He submerged himself in the language with the same intensity he brought to everything else, staying deliberately away from Spanish-speaking communities until English became something he could think in rather than translate into. He later credited her, without any hesitation, for the trajectory his career took. In 2004, a production company called Miles Per Hour Entertainment built a television pitch around what Cesar was already doing with dogs across Los Angeles. On September 13th of that year, Dog Whisperer with Cesar Millan premiered on the National Geographic Channel. Almost no one paid attention. The network barely promoted it. The time slots were short and far from prime time. But word of mouth did what the marketing department had not bothered to attempt, and by the second season the show had expanded to a full hour in prime time. By the 6th season, 11 million Americans were tuning in every single week to watch a calm man in a black t-shirt walk into households where families had been living in fear of their own animals and restore order with what looked, on a television screen, like pure instinct and quiet authority. The scientific community had not been watching quietly. The criticism directed at Cesar's methods had started almost immediately after the show found its audience, and it came from serious institutions with serious credentials. The core of Cesar's philosophy was something he described as calm, assertive energy. His argument was that dogs understand social hierarchy, that they are always looking for a leader within their group, and that most behavioral problems trace back to a failure by the human in the household to occupy that leadership role. When a dog acts out, becomes anxious, becomes aggressive, or becomes destructive, the cause in Cesar's framework was almost always a vacuum at the top of the pack. His job was to step into that vacuum and demonstrate through body language, through energy, and through confident physical presence that the natural order had been restored. On screen, this looked compelling and felt intuitively true. A dog that had been unmanageable for years going quiet within an afternoon session was powerful television. The framework was simple, visual, and satisfying in a way that made it feel self-evidently correct. The problem was that the research the framework rested on had already been contested and largely discredited within the scientific community before the show aired its first episode. The original studies that produced dominance theory were conducted on captive wolves living in artificial conditions that did not resemble anything close to how wolf packs actually function in natural environments. When researchers began studying wolves in the wild, what they found looked nothing like the alpha model. Leadership within real wolf families was exercised by parent figures within family units, not through aggressive competition for dominance over rivals. The model that Cesar's entire method was built upon had already been undermined at its foundation. Dr. Nicholas Dodman, who directed the Animal Behavior Clinic at Tufts University, wrote directly to the National Geographic Channel in 2006 to say that the show had pushed the field of dog training backward by at least 2 decades. That same year, a respected writer on animal behavior published a piece in the New York Times making the same argument in public, specifically targeting dominance theory as directly contradicting what professional behaviorists and trained veterinarians had established through controlled research. The American Humane Association went further than criticism. They formally asked National Geographic to remove the show from the air entirely, describing the methods as inhumane, outdated, and actively dangerous for viewers who might attempt to replicate them at home. Cesar was not without a response to all of this, and his response was not without substance. He pointed out that the people publishing academic critiques from university positions had never walked into a room with a 90-pound dog that had a real history of biting people and had to make a decision in real time without the safety net of a theory. That was a genuine point. The gap between research environments and practical field experience is real, and his track record across hundreds of genuinely dangerous cases was not something that could be dismissed by citing methodology critiques. But the accumulation of institutional opposition was real as well, and it was building pressure on the network from multiple directions simultaneously. The lawsuits arrived in 2006, barely 2 years into the show's run, and they arrived in a way that suggested the legal environment around the program was not going to be a temporary problem. The first complaint came from a television producer named Floaty Suarez, who alleged that his 5-year-old Labrador had been seriously injured at Cesar's Dog Psychology Center. The details described in the complaint were severe. The dog had been found bleeding from the mouth and nose, covered in extensive bruising, struggling to breathe in an oxygen tent. Veterinary bills were reported to have exceeded $25,000. The case was settled out of court the following year, but the settlement did not erase the details that had already become public. That same week, a second lawsuit was filed by a former publicist and her partner, who claimed they had originally developed the concept and the name Dog Whisperer, and that Cesar had taken the idea directly to National Geographic and production partners without their involvement or compensation. They sought more than $5 million. 2 lawsuits in a single week in the middle of the show's second season was a pattern, not a coincidence. But neither of those lawsuits was the one that would ultimately contribute most decisively to the show's end. The legal story that has received almost no attention in most accounts of what happened is the financial war that broke out between Cesar himself and the production company that had created the show around him. Cesar sued Miles Per Hour Entertainment, claiming that they had withheld back-end profits from the series that were rightfully his. Miles Brow filed counterclaims. An independent audit conducted during the litigation allegedly found that Cesar had actually underpaid his own financial obligations to the production company by more than $4 million. National Geographic discovered that episodes had been distributed on Hulu since 2009 without authorization and moved to join the legal action to recover revenues it argued should have come to the network. The author of the Dog Whisperer book series filed a separate lawsuit against Miles Brow alleging fraud and breach of fiduciary duty, with a complaint describing the company's principals as having maneuvered to shield themselves from financial accountability. By the time the show reached its final season, the star, the production company, the network, and the book author were all in active legal conflict with each other at the same time. What that meant for National Geographic as an institution was not complicated. On one side, a show that major scientific and animal welfare organizations had publicly called dangerous and irresponsible, a declining ratings trend, and growing discomfort among advertisers. On the other side, a production structure that had fractured into simultaneous lawsuits pointed in every direction at once. No network renews a show under those conditions. The risk calculation was not a close one. All of the external pressure, every lawsuit, every scientific statement, every advertiser concern, was real. But it was not what actually broke Cesar Millan as a person. That happened on a different timeline entirely, and it happened fast. In February of 2010, a 16-year-old pit bull named Daddy died. This requires some explanation for anyone who only knew the show casually, because Daddy was not simply a trained animal used for television demonstrations. He was Cesar's most important working partner across the entire run of the show and across years before the show existed. Daddy possessed a quality that Cesar had never been able to fully describe or replicate. He was instinctively and naturally calm in the presence of anxious or aggressive animals. He functioned as a living demonstration of what balanced energy actually looked like, the kind of settled, non-threatening presence that Cesar spent 9 seasons trying to teach human beings to project. He had been with Cesar through the years before the cameras, through every season, through every crisis. When he died, Cesar described losing a part of himself that simply could not be replaced. For months after that, his wife Illusion filed for divorce after 16 years of marriage and 2 sons. The marriage had been the one genuinely private space in a life that had been entirely public for most of a decade. When it ended, whatever psychological ground Cesar had been standing on was gone. He has spoken about what followed with a directness that is unusual even now. He attempted suicide. He overdosed on pills and was found unconscious. He survived. He declined medication during the recovery period and chose instead to rebuild through physical discipline and by returning to the work that had always given his days structure and meaning. He has described the period publicly as the lowest point he had ever reached emotionally and psychologically, and has said that surviving it fundamentally changed how he pays attention to the people around him, particularly his sons. The man who had spent 9 years demonstrating calm, assertive energy to millions of viewers, who had walked into rooms full of terrified families and restored order through the sheer force of his own groundedness, had reached a point where he could not find any stability inside himself at all. The cancellation was announced in June of 2012. 12 final episodes aired through July and August. On September 15th of that year, the show ended after 9 seasons and 176 total episodes. Cesar announced it on social media with a gracious and largely uninformative statement that said almost nothing about the actual circumstances. The years after the show ended revealed something that neither the critics nor the most devoted supporters had fully accounted for. Research into the actual long-term outcomes of cases from the show found results that were more complicated than either side of the debate had been willing to acknowledge. Some of the animals Cesar worked with showed genuine and lasting behavioral improvement. Others showed what appeared to be improvement on camera, but was actually suppression of symptoms through aversive techniques, with problems returning or worsening over time. The methods worked for some animals and caused harm in others, and the television format made it essentially impossible for viewers to distinguish which category their own dog fell into before attempting to replicate what they had seen. This is what the disclaimer that appeared in the credits of every episode was actually pointing toward. The notice advising viewers not to attempt these techniques at home was not a routine legal protection. It was an acknowledgement by the network itself that what was being broadcast was not universally safe to replicate. That acknowledgement existed in every episode for years, while the network continued airing the content and collecting the advertising revenue. What happened next was not what the critics expected and not what most of the show's audience predicted either. Cesar launched a touring stage production called Cesar Millan Live, working with shelter dogs in front of live audiences. Animals that had never met him. Dogs with genuine behavioral problems. No editing to smooth over the moments when things did not resolve immediately. For someone whose critics had spent years arguing that the television format was hiding the real complexity of his methods, performing live with unpredictable rescue animals in front of crowds was a direct and visible response to that argument. In 2014, a new show called Cesar 911 premiered on Nat Geo Wild, focusing specifically on the most severe cases, animals whose behavior was dangerous enough that their owners were days away from surrendering or euthanizing them. That show ran for 4 seasons. A YouTube channel he built gathered more than 1 million subscribers. He became engaged to a woman named Jahira, with a proposal in Athens in front of the Acropolis. And then in 2021, National Geographic, the same network that had ended Dog Whisperer nearly a decade earlier, brought him back with a new program called Better Human, Better Dog. That return is the most honest summary of what the whole story actually meant. Not a final verdict in either direction. Not a complete vindication, and not a complete condemnation. A man who was genuinely gifted at something real, working within a framework that was partly flawed, on a show that succeeded enormously and collapsed under the combined weight of money, science, law, and personal crisis, and who then rebuilt himself with the same